Thanks, Pauline. Hello, everyone. I prepared a talk for you, and I'm going to read it out, basically. So it'll be about 30 minutes where I will present to you. I'm not showing any slides, so take a step back, close your eyes, and imagine what my words to you. And it might get a bit thick at times, so if you do need me to repeat, please feel free to stop me, and I can repeat a paragraph or a sentence. Okay, so today I would like to discuss the beyond of activism for the arts, or at least the arts landscape for me as a visual artist of Southeast Asian heritage, working within the context of social, legal, and political practice. A beyond of activism, of course, means that we need to first begin with activism in order to understand how to go beyond it. Today, I want to offer you a provocation in 3 parts. First, I want to share with you my experience of co-running an artist-led campaign this year to defund and boycott the Centre for Chinese Contemporary Art in Manchester, CFCCA. I will view our continued call for its defunding I view our continued call for its defunding as an act of care and loving activism. I won't go into the idea of loving activism or care here because I want to talk to you about the beyond of activism. But if you want, you can look at the documentation of a talk that I gave at Innova's Handle with Care conference on the 25th of November for my thoughts on this topic. Secondly, I'd like to explore how to get to a beyond of CFCCA. As yet, we don't know what this will look like, but I wish to speculate on a set of methodologies for creating this new platform or platforms. At the moment, there are 4 approaches that inform my thinking about how we should create a new arts ecology for East and Southeast Asian artists, and I will describe these later. And finally, the 3rd part, I want to demonstrate how I'm setting these methodologies into motion through experimenting and performatively speculating on new governance and legal forms and formings within my own practice. And I will briefly survey 5 projects to show you what I mean. So to begin, firstly, activism and the case of the Centre for Chinese Contemporary Art, or CFCCA. In the autumn of 2020, I, along with 6 other artists of Chinese heritage, were invited to form an artist working group that would co-design the revisioning of CFCCA as their partners. We were mostly artists in our 40s and 50s, and some of us had been working with CFCCA or in its orbit since the late 80s, when its predecessor, the Chinese Arts Centre in Manchester, was founded. From the start of the revisioning process, we encountered an attempt to redefine what partner and what co-design meant from its ordinary meaning and from how those words were represented to us during the initial conversations about our terms of engagement. We had been offered genuine partnership and given an undertaking that our revisioning work would be taken seriously, including real demonstrable impact on the organization in its vision, mission, and values, and its forthcoming NPO business planning. Well, this was not the case, and we were confined and herded from the start. Access to documents and information was limited, frequently citing confidentiality as a reason. A white-led consultancy was also put in place to mediate between us and the organization, or as CFCCA puts it, to facilitate and support the revisioning process. As Chinese artists, we had to do the hard work of analyzing this and other instances of institutional and performative gaslighting, always being critical of our own conflicts of interest in the process, and also paying attention to the dynamics of the very particular operations of anti-Asian racism occurring as our working relationship with CFCCA played out. So briefly though, the particularities of anti-Asian racism at play, as I saw it, related to, for example, institutional Orientalism at CFCCA and our objectification as artists of Chinese heritage. The model minority myth that we as Chinese people were expected to be acquiescent, submissive, and nice during the revisioning process, well, then, but shock, outrage, defensiveness, white tears, and accusations of us harming staff resulted when we weren't behaving like model ethnic minority people. Also, in the history of how Chinese labor in the West has been used as a form of scabbing or strike breaking, particularly in the place of Black or working class labor, and also itself being a form of racist exploitation, that we would be used to yellowface the organization or to validate its institutionally racist culture so that business could carry on as usual, which was the business of being an ethnic minority culture organization run by white gatekeepers who wish to continue centering neoliberal, globalized, and secondary art market practices in artworks. That's my opinion. And I share this opinion with many of my colleagues on the Artists Working Group. During the revisioning process, an informal boycott by previous artists was also a significant narrative for us, exemplified by artist J.J. Chan's open letter to CFCCA, as well as revelations in Morgan Quaintance's Studio Visit podcast of the culture of racist bullying at CFCCA and the actual harm done to staff and volunteers. Following our critique and questions about organizational systems that create such racist outcomes, in March this year, CFCCA decided that they would put our work on hold so that they could reflect on their white fragility, which in itself is a response that revealed CFCCA's misunderstanding of white fragility. I mean, you don't address white fragility by becoming more fragile. CFCCA gave no indication of how long their reflection would take and when we would get back on board with the work. During this pause, we discovered that CFCCA was actually carrying on with the work without us by commissioning an internal audit of their processes. So we realized that we had been quietly put down. And as we feared, our involvement would indeed be used to create a narrative that CFCCA had consulted Chinese artists who had helped them or sanctioned them. You can actually read this narrative now on their website. So in May, we launched our public report outlining our own findings. We called for the Arts Council to evaluate, investigate, and ultimately defund CFCCA. We called for a general boycott from working with CFCCA, attending their shows, donating to them, or buying their merchandise. CFCCA has been put on a kind of watch alert, you might call it, or I'm told by the Arts Council, or a kind of, it's like a kind of Ofsted special measures, if you will. Artists have continued to boycott, decline invitations, and avoid CFCCA. The organization has recently published an executive summary of its internal audit report, which, to be frank, is quite damning in finding that CFCCA had, and I quote, a lack of Chinese representation and competent leadership, unquote, resulting in high discontentment and a culture of disharmony, mistrust, culture of resistance, and fixed mindsets. This week, the Artists Working Group has issued our response to this audit in our closing report. We welcome some of the audit's findings, but we are still largely critical of the internal and secret nature of this investigation. Its failure to recommend trust, care, and trauma repair as a focus for the organization going forwards, and the report's lack of findings about CFCCA's failure to meet its leadership role in UK culture, particularly at a time when its communities and artists are facing anti-Asian hate and violence as a result of racist media and government portrayals of East and Southeast Asians as a source of COVID and disease. Ultimately, we disagree with the audit conclusion that CFCCA is redeemable as an organization. We don't think it's redeemable because it has made no efforts to date to restore trust or to reconcile with stakeholders that it has harmed. It hasn't acknowledged that it is institutionally racist, partly because I think, like many organizations, CFCCA confuses institutional racism with personal racism, and it continues to demonstrate a fixed and resistive mindset. Even in its most recent public activity last month, which was to recruit a new director and a public programs curator, CFCCA could not bring itself to meet its own audit recommendations, which was to include in all job descriptions the requirement for staff to have a respect for and a demonstrable experience of Chinese culture. Instead, the job packs that went out last month used the orientalizing and objectifying language of merely requiring an appreciation of Chinese culture, whereby we concluded as the Artists Working Group that CFCCA's institutional optic is one where it continues to seek to fill its leadership with spectators of Chinese culture, rather than people with the lived experience or even a vicarious lived experience of Chineseness. More importantly, though, our closing report is just that. It is a closing report because we want to close the chapter on this campaign. For me, it's simply because I have said what I've wanted to say in order to fill out the public record of this part of the arts sector from an artist's point of view. But also, to put it bluntly, from CFCCA's behavior, even after its own audit, I just don't care anymore about this organization. I don't care enough to critique it anymore. CFCCA has and is demonstrating its growing irrelevance to me as an East and Southeast Asian artist as I look towards imagining and building a future that I want to see for myself and my fellow creatives. So what is this future? And so in the second part of my talk, what is the great beyond of activism?